All right.
I have one.
All right.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. It's 4:02. So I welcome everyone to Sex, Rage, and Change, Feminist Adaptation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. I'm Stephanie McCarter. I'm an associate professor of classics at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. I'm currently wrapping up a translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses into iambic pentameter for Penguin Classics, which is due out next year in the fall of 2022. And I'll start by introducing my two guests. Paisley Rechtel is the author of a book of essays, The Night My Mother Met Bruce Lee, a hybrid genre phototext entitled Intimate, and 6 books of poetry, A Crash of Rhinos, 6 Girls Without Pants, The Invention of the Kaleidoscope, Animal Eye, winner of the UNT Rilke Prize, and Imaginary Vessels, which was a finalist for the 2018 Kingsley Tufts Prize, and Nightingale. Her book, The Broken Country, won the 2016 AWP Nonfiction Prize, and her newest work of nonfiction, Appropriate, a Provocation, was published by W.W. Norton in 2021. Her work has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Fulbright Foundation, the Amy Lowell Poetry Traveling Scholarship Trust, and various state arts councils. Her poetry has been included in multiple editions of the Best American Poetry series, and she was guest editor for Best American Poetry in 2020. She is Utah's Poet Laureate. Nina McLaughlin is the author of the acclaimed memoir Hammerhead, The Making of a Carpenter from W.W. Norton in 2016, the book-length essay Summer Solstice from Black Sparrow in 2020, as well as Wake Siren, Ovid Resung, a retelling of Ovid's Metamorphoses from FSG Originals in 2019. Formerly an editor at the Boston Phoenix, she worked for 9 years as a carpenter and is now a books columnist for the Boston Globe. Her work has appeared regularly in the Paris Review Daily, which is how I first became familiar with her writing, and in The Believer, Agni, American Short Fiction, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Wall Street Journal, Meat Paper, and elsewhere. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I am delighted that Paisley and Nina accepted my invitation for this conversation. Both of them have given us remarkable and timely reimaginings of Ovid's grand epic. Nina's book, Wake Siren, creatively rewrites the Metamorphoses in a series of stories narrated by the transformed women of the epic, whose voices ring as true today as they did 2,000 years ago. While Paisley Rechtel's Nightingale poignantly weaves Ovidian myth into a poetry collection that tackles the themes of sexual violence, identity, and change. I could not be more thrilled to be speaking with them today about their brilliant work. Please feel free to type questions into the Q&A, which I'll be monitoring as we go, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. And we thought we would begin by each giving a short reading, taking up Ovid's story of Procne and Philomela. Paisley, would you like to begin?
Sure. So I should warn people a little bit that when I decided to contemporize these stories, I left them pretty far behind. So sometimes the only thing that would actually indicate that I'm speaking to that particular myth is the title itself. And I did that for 2 reasons. One is I know a lot of readers don't necessarily know Ovid's takes on these myths or the myths in general. So if you know him, great. And this is an audience that's terrific because you are going to know this. But this is my version of Philomela. Because her grandmother loved the arts, her father said, she'd willed the money to a distant cousin working as a sculptor. A decision made the month before she died from cancer, which the young woman cannot now believe was due only to a brain tumor, having endured the last deliberate ways her grandmother asked why she'd never married. The cousin, who inherited the money, showed her sculptures in a converted barn, the only space large enough to contain the seething shapes that seemed to flame up from their pedestals in precarious arcs. An audacity of engineering the young woman tried not to see as a reproach when, curious, she visited, how the sculptures made her feel too earthbound, solid. At the gallery, she stared a long while at what she thought was a tree blasted by lightning, but the more she looked, the more clearly shapes emerged. There were a man's hands gripping a slender figure by the waist, her thin body writhing, frozen in his arms. It was a girl, she saw, with shredded bark for breasts and dark, charred wood for legs, as if the limbs had been snatched from a fire while burning. Her twig hand raked her captor's face. The young woman could read no emotion on it, however. The plank face had been scraped clean. All the fear and anger burned instead inside their twisting bodies. She could see the two there stuck at a point of perfect hatred for each other. She for his attack, he for her resistance, perhaps the beauty he could not stand in her, as her last date in college had hissed. You think you're so fucking pretty, spitting it into her face so that she'd had to turn her cheek to wipe it, which was when he grabbed her arm, pinning her. Was this why her cousin had been chosen? To make what she'd had no words for? Persephone, the piece she stood amazed before, had been titled The Last, Perhaps Unconscious Gift of Her Grandmother. For your wedding, her grandmother had said during her last week, pointing to her own open palm in which nothing rested. Perhaps her grandmother had imagined a gold ring there, perhaps a string of thick pink pearls. The young woman drove home from the gallery, took a shower, and did not tell anyone that day what it was she'd seen. A month later, in the mail, a package came from her father. Her grandmother's Singer sewing machine, its antique brass wheels scrubbed of gold, the wooden handle glossy with vines of mother of pearl. It was lovely, and for a moment she considered sewing a quilt with it onto which she might embroider shooting stars and reds and saffron, the figure of a child perhaps, or of a man by house's courtyard, his hat in his hands, his broad body naked, harmless. How much thread would that take to make, she wondered, and considered it a long while before packing up the machine again, sliding it back into its wood crate and high up onto a shelf of her bedroom closet, the place she kept some books, old clothes, and college papers, where she told herself it could wait.
Thank you so much. Nina, would you like to read?
Sure, thanks. Paisley, that's really amazing. And Stephanie, thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this. I've been looking forward to this for a while. In Wake Siren, the Procne and Philomela story is, it's the longest piece in the book, and it's also, to my mind, the most brutal and intense. And it's one I've actually never read out loud, and was saying to Paisley and Stephanie earlier, like it's an uncomfortable one. And so I guess I will sort of warn you, I mean, this little chunk that I'm gonna read is a little bit violent. This sort of is at the moment where Procne and Philomela have murdered young Idis. Is that how you guys pronounce? Mm-hmm. Yep. And they're just about to sort of confront Tereus with it. And so this is narrated by Procne as sort of a tour guide through this story. I kept laughing. Imagine it, please. Please imagine my laughter as I told Tereus that our son was right here. And now please imagine Philomela rushing in, and please imagine how her hair is matted with blood, and there's blood underneath her nails. On her neck, she is wild-eyed and covered with blood. And please now imagine the head of Idis in her hand. Imagine his small head, skull with face attached, a terrible purple-gray color to his cheeks, his eyes dull, like coated in wax paper and lilting up into their corners, his soft mouth hanging open as though in sleep, a bit of spine poking out from his neck, a jagged, dripping piece of severed spine. Please imagine this. And please imagine the weight of a child's head in your hand. Are you imagining this? Imagine it. Its hair between your fingers, the hardness of its skull against your knuckles, knowing that a quarter-inch below is the brain that told his heart to beat, that let him learn words like mama, that held his small boy joys and sadnesses. There it is, in your hand. And now please imagine throwing it, because that is what Philomela does. She hurls the head of Idis right at Tereus. She takes his small head and she hurls it at his face. She'd never wanted more to be able to speak, to be able to form words with her tongue, to shout out, to be able to sing her joy.
Thank you so much. Well, I hate to follow both of those because those are so amazing and brilliant, but I did want to read just a little bit from my translation because I haven't read it much publicly from this same tell, and to take us back into the world of myth. You've both given us versions of this that feel so real and now, and so mine will take us back into, as I said, the world of myth. So this is the moment when Philomela finds a way to reclaim her lost voice after Tereus rapes her and cuts out her tongue. The god had passed through 1 year's zodiac. And what should Philomela do? She can't escape her jail, the cabin's thick stone walls. Her silent mouth cannot reveal what's happened. But grief can make us very shrewd, and craft is born from pain. On a barbarian loom she hangs a warp, and into its white threads she weaves red markings to reveal the crime. When done, she gave it to a slave, requesting through gestures that she take it to her mistress. The slave, as ordered, carried it to Procne, not knowing what she handed over. When the brutal tyrant's wife unrolls the garment, she reads the mournful song of her own sister, and what's amazing, does not speak. Her grief has sealed her lips. Her tongue cannot find words that match her wrath. She has no time to weep, but rushes to confuse what's right and wrong, consumed by the idea of punishment. Well, I was going to start by asking you to you read a question, and then we can just take it from there. But so I know we have lots of questions for each other, but I just want to ask how you both went back to Ovid. I know that you both have background in classics, as I think I've read in interviews. So what made you decide to return to the Roman past? Nina, would you like to go first?
Sure. So I majored in classics in college and had never actually read the Metamorphoses, and decided to read it when I was working on my first book, Hammerhead, because I wanted something that wasn't going to interfere with the sort of rhythms and storytelling ideas that I was trying to do in that book. I was like, oh, great, this 12,000 line poem, that certainly won't interfere with this memoir about being a carpenter. And it ended up being the backbone of that book. And so it was this really powerful reading experience. And then a couple years ago was in sort of a reading drought and picked it up again. And just sort of as almost a writing exercise, just wrote one of the stories in a different perspective, and it felt so good. And it was sort of this immediate, like, well, geez, I'll do another one. And then almost immediately just kind of came out. And it was a story of Callisto that I started with. I am a bear, I live in the sky. And there was just the energy just felt totally right. So it's a book, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's a book that I feel can return to sort of in any moment. And every time offers something new to me as well.
Yeah, so I was not a major in classics, but when I was in high school, I took Latin, and then in college, I took ancient Greek and Anglo-Saxon, and I was working my way into medieval literature. And so I went to medieval studies for graduate school, and started going back to Latin again. And then I kind of turned to poetry. I was kind of always writing poetry, but I'm sort of steeped in classics and myth, and I grew up listening to and reading these myths. And in college, just, reading the Metamorphoses over and over, and just kind of like really just loving that world. And, in medieval studies, medieval literature, Ovid holds a really big, powerful push. And it wasn't actually until, sadly, I never thought of myself as somebody who was, responding to political movements of the moment. But, when then candidate Trump was, caught on tape saying, you can do anything with beautiful women, you can just grab them by the, whatever. And that really just had grabbed me in an awful way. And, I had been working sort of just kind of casually on these poems in Nightingale, thinking I was just going to play around kind of to get myself out of a writer's block by retelling, contemporizing these myths. And it wasn't until I was talking to somebody else and they said, how can you be working on Ovid? He's so rapey. And I just thought, but it was very striking to me because when I had written Philomela, I had not my version of it. I was dissatisfied with it, and I got it published, and it appeared in Best American Poetry. Gotten all these things that would suggest this poem was finished, but it wasn't finished for me. And it wasn't until I actually heard, Trump say that. And, I sat down and I was like, why am I still unhappy with my version of Philomela? So I wrote this really long poem essay called Nightingale, a Gloss. And that's when I understood what the book was about. It was about voicelessness. Mm-hmm. It was about not just change, but voicelessness and art and representation. What does art purport to do for us? And then I realized, okay, I'm not translating all the myths. I'm translating some very particular, or adapting some very particular myths around that question.
That's interesting. The first thing I read, actually, of yours, I read first was Nightingale, a Gloss. For some reason, I read that before I read Philomela. And
same with me, actually.
Yeah. Can I ask you one? This is a pretty specific question about it. Were you thinking of the tie between the word gloss and the Greek word glossa, tongue? Did that?
No, I was not. But it kills me that I didn't. But it's funny because after, I was thinking about gloss in a very, very conventional sense, which is this is the gloss on the original poem that I wrote, but it's also a gloss on Ovid, and it's a gloss on how we read these things. But, gloss also has the meaning of something that's a false tale too. And so some people have actually said, is this you? That's the person in the story? Like, how much do we take this as real or fantasy? And so there's all these other ways of thinking about how to translate and speak to that word. So no, I wish I had, but I'm glad of all of these possibilities.
One of the things that was so striking to me was there's a line in Nightingale, a Gloss, not because a contemporary reader can't imagine them, but because the details are now too grotesque for her to want to.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this a lot because in the Procne and Philomela story that I had done, there's this repeated throughout the whole thing, please imagine this.
Yeah.
And sort of feeling like, as I was sort of revisiting that in my own work, I was like, geez, like, gosh, like almost thinking like, is it a cruelty in some ways to ask? And I guess I'd be curious to your perspective on like, is there a cruelty to asking people to revisit these stories?
Well, okay, so this is exactly where I wanted to talk to you about it because, I think we're all aware that there's a lot of students now that don't want to read Ovid, and for exactly this reason, which is that it is a cruel and rapey and violent text, and there are reasons why that might be, and I'm interested in what that is. But when I was writing Nightingale, a Gloss, this is about a sexual assault that I experienced. And then I refract it through Ovid and through ways of reading Ovid and reading the language around rape as it sort of develops over the centuries. But at the core of it is this anxiety that I have as a writer all the time, and I'm curious about you, which is if you're good at describing things and you're good at imagining things, you are excellent at getting people in a scene, and that scene can be beautiful or can be violent. And the difference between voyeurism, spectatorship, and sort of an ethical, critical response is razor thin, and you never know when you've crossed into that line. And I think that that's what's so interesting about some student responses about not wanting to read the Metamorphoses, which is, are we here to read these rape scenes as primarily a way of spectatorship, voyeurism? Are we meant to take delight in them? Or are we meant to stand back and say that the person who does this is in fact wrong? And there's something so dark about that Philomela myth, because first Philomela and Procne go from the wounded parties to killer. I mean, you're the piece that you read, right? So I'm kind of curious from your end, like, how do you think about that ethical, that knife's edge that you walk as a writer?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think when I was working on this book, I really, a lot of it was just, as I say, sort of coming out. And so thinking about it in sort of who's going to be reading this and who's going to be responding to it, there was no awareness for me when I was doing that. And it wasn't until the sort of first round of edits when I actually read it over for the first time. I really had not, like, I just sort of wrote it and sent it off. And reading it over for the first time, especially that story, it was this very distressing experience, you know, sort of being like, wow, like in part barely remembering writing it, and in part the level of brutality and violence. And I guess, gosh, you know, I had been invited to my high school Latin teacher invited me to come talk to his class. And he was saying how when he's teaching Ovid, they're doing the translations, he doesn't address the fact that there's so much rape. He's like, you know, it just feels so uncomfortable. We don't really discuss it. And I was like, well, you know, I think you should discuss it, you know? And and I think that this is like, to me, it's like, what's the sort of mind skewing aspect of it is that we just read it and it's sort of like, oh, this is just normal. This is just how it was. These are the structures of power. And it's glossed over. When in fact, like, I don't know, one of the things I want to talk to you both about is like the idea of trigger warnings. I mean, Stephanie, I'd be very curious about how you approach that, but it's this idea of, there's so much richness in Ovid. There's so many beautiful stories that it is this sort of like, you know, foundation of so many of our myths, for good and bad. But I feel like it needs to be talked about. And so I guess I guess it's like my hope is that these stories, as brutal and violent as they are, help that conversation along, you know, and sort of say like, yeah, there's beauty here, and there's also like terrible, insidious violence.
And I have to think that part of Ovid's project was very self-conscious around that, because there's as much violence as appears in the text, there's also so much direction towards art and representation itself, the representation making. I mean, Philomela weaves, right. Arachne weaves, you know, people sculpt, people, you know, there's always these turns towards art. Even before this, when we were talking about like my favorite moment in the text with the Europa turning back, and you're saying it's an acrostic moment, like art is so deeply woven in there. And this question of how much does art represent suffering and trauma and speak back to the, really horrific things that were done to people. I mean, I think about the myth of Arachne, where, you know, where Arachne, the thing that really sends Minerva is not that she's a great weaver, but that she weaves a tapestry of all of the things the gods have done. And she points out, you know, you're cruel, you're arbitrary, you're horrible, you do these things to us. And we are utterly subject to your power and your whims. And what does art do but at that moment sort of suggest a kind of retribution, a mirror that is held back. So, you know, like when we do read these really grotesque descriptions of violence, are they meant to enact certain types of emotions in us, critical lenses? You know, are they meant to say, you know, this is what power does, this is what power is? I mean, that's what Trump's argument was, which is it can do anything it wants to, usually in the most brutal and violent ways.
One thing that strikes me about the fact that both of you all are writing, I mean, you're women, you're writing from a modern perspective, is, you know, your critical stance towards the violence is very obvious, right? I mean, it's not as obvious, I think, when you're reading Ovid. Sometimes it's very hard to know the degree to which he's being critical of the violence he's describing. And which is one thing that has concerned me, I think, as a translator of the text, is am I giving voice to a kind of you know, new voice to someone who's reveling in violence, right? And I happen to agree with you, Paisley, that I think Ovid is much more interested in thinking through the ramifications of violence than reveling in the details of it initially. I mean, the more I read of Ovid, the more I think he is presenting us with the perspectives of the victims more than the, you know, but you know, you mentioned, Paisley, and this is something I think both of you deal with in your books very well, is the limitations of art to speak to trauma and to heal trauma. I mean, Paisley, in some ways, your book seems to rule that out in some ways altogether, right? So if art doesn't allow us to process trauma, then what is its relationship with trauma, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it totally does. I think it's sort of unfortunate that I was writing Nightingale right after writing this book called The Broken Country, which is all about transgenerational trauma and legacies of the Vietnam War. And so I did a lot of studies, did a lot of research and reading in trauma therapy, and it's all sort of narrative based. The idea is if you can put these horrible events into language, into a story, once you get that story, you can encapsulate, you can move from this sort of melancholic lashing out to a kind of mourning process and moving on. But the thing about storytelling, and I'm curious about your perspective on this, Nina, is that, you know, especially if you're a writer, you can always fiddle. You're like, I missed that detail. I missed this. I need to go back and retell this story to get that right. And so instead, for me, I find that the thing about narrative and narrativity is that instead of ending trauma, it forces you back into that wheel potentially to make the better story. And it's again that question of artistry that sends us back into the thing that, you know, we cannot reconcile. And, you know, so for me, when I was rewriting Philomel the first time, that's why she falls silent. You know, there's the sculptor, the woman who may, you know, this cousin who has not been raped is able to depict what has happened to this woman that she herself cannot. And, you know, because she herself is sort of put beyond language. And when she's given an opportunity to create art out of that, she pushes it away. And I think, to my mind, that's a far more maybe contemporary and accurate psychological thing. Most people have these horrific things that happen to them and they don't put into language because they recognize that it falls outside of something that we're given. But that doesn't mean we're not going to put it in some sort of artistic kind of capacity. It'll get sublimated somewhere. But there is a paradox. I mean, as a writer, like, why am I, if I didn't believe in the power of writing, why the hell am I doing it? And I don't know, but I continue to do it. I don't know. What do you think, Nina? I'm just,
yeah, I mean, I'm struck by this idea in Nightingale about, you describe the sexual assault and you make the point that in some ways, not having a word for it saved you in some ways, you know, that it allowed you to sort of move through it in a way that some sort of, you know, like a brochure or like very specific language form might not have let you do that. And gosh, like, I don't know, I guess I you know, thinking a lot about what it is to say or not say, and what we sort of put forth and don't. And the poet Charles Simic says the highest states of consciousness are wordless. And I think like that's, you know, you can think about that in the sort of transcendent, you know, these most beautiful moments of grace and, you know, connection and whatever. But I think it can also be the darkest parts, you know, where language fails. And I think, I guess in thinking about Wake Siren, it was thinking about, all right, like, how would these women tell these stories if they were the ones telling it, you know, if they were the ones sort of given voice, in situations that are sort of not indescribable, because obviously they're describable, but sort of always coming up against the limits of language and coming up against the sort of, how do you put to words what is really deeply, essentially wordless.
What I also find interesting about your collection of stories, though, is that so oftentimes these, when they're telling their stories, there's an inherent mediation within the ways they're telling a story, not just because they're, you know, you're writing, you know, that kind of mediation, but like, so for instance, in Mira, she's telling her story to a therapist, which I thought was a really sly and brilliant way of getting to sort of like the Freudian bits of this, right? Where, you know, obviously if it's a traumatic experience, you know, you tell your psychoanalyst and stuff like that. And it, you know, and she is in fact doing this. So it's a kind of play on both those things. But because of that mediation, you're also highly aware of the audience too. And one of my favorite stories that you do, your retelling of Tiresias, which I found incredibly moving, so moving. And the, you know, like the point is, at what point are we just human? And this idea of separating this out into gender and pleasure and stuff like that becomes meaningless, because what does one human know versus another? But that mediation of like knowing what, you know, Zeus, Jupiter would know, and Juno would know, but this always an awareness of audience. And I think that's the thing that's so, the thing about art is that, you know, as writers, we might say, oh, I write for myself, but that's really never true. You know, we're always highly aware of an imagined audience and things like that. And I mean, going back to Ovid, and I'm curious about, you know, your take on this, Stephanie. I mean, Ovid must have been extremely aware of audience, because I mean, of course, now you've got an empire, it went from a republic to an empire, and suddenly you've got, an emperor who might banish you, which she did eventually, not for this, but, that there was a sense that people were really watching. So, I mean, the question of like how you write about power under the lens, under the gaze of something that is a little frightening. I mean, I think that might be another reason why I was interested in Ovid at this time, shifting power dynamics. But
yeah, there are moments when reading Ovid, I think to myself, how did he get away with that?
Yeah,
I mean, it is really bold. I'm thinking of this one moment in book 15 where he's playing with the idea of freedom, and he's like, reputation is free. I think that is. I can't remember the exact words, but the implication is, you can't say what's going to happen in this regard, Augustus. So I mean, there were moments when the way he presents power, the way he presents Apollo in the epic are really shocking to me. In terms of audience too. I'm keenly aware that I wasn't really a part of the original audience, and to me, there's something I really like about that. In some way, I'm approaching Ovid from a perspective that he never intended, because I'm a woman, right? And I don't know to what degree women would have been a part of that original audience, but I like at least placing myself in the position of being a critical reader of Ovid that he may not have expected. And approaching the text through that critical kind of lens. But I wonder to what degree, though, he did envision women in his audience, because so many of the poems are told from the perspective of the female or the disempowered or the victim. When I don't know if that's who I imagine his audience to be, but it is, I think, what keeps Ovid feeling really relevant and interesting, even when he is so rapey and violent.
Yes, yeah. Let me ask, because I feel so curious about your life as a translator. Do you try to sort of drop into Ovid's mind? Is that sort of part of the process, to sort of say, like, what was he in fact intending and thinking here?
I'm keenly aware of that translation is an interpretation. So there's no way I can purport in any way to be objective in what I'm doing. Like, I'm not even trying to wear that mantle in a way, because I don't think it's possible. We were talking about, A.E. Stallings as a translator prior to, going live here. And, she has the best phrase. It's a deep reading of a poem. And I think about that all the time. And if we're not aware that we are going into translation with some kind of biases, some kind of critical, then we could fall into the trap of thinking we are offering an objective translation. And that's dangerous, I think. Because then you can get things like, rape translated as consensual sex, when in fact it's not. And
yeah, she enjoyed that. Yeah, right.
right. I'm just telling you what Ovid said here, right?
Yeah, I like that idea, and it goes back to the question of audience, which is, obviously the audience. You're not speaking back to Augustus's era. You're speaking to our era and stuff, like how we're going to respond to, or what we're going to be interested in, and all of that. And in that case, I was thinking about some of the translations. We were talking about some bad translations we've read about other things. And I would mention Dorothy Sayers' disastrous, translation of the Inferno, where she decided to do it in this sort of like 1940s noir. Like, there's this fine line between like, how do I make something relevant and then like falling into a gimmick. But I do think, like, having read Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, that there were really sort of distinct things that happened, like the way that she interpreted, reimagined Helen, in her speeches. I thought was, instead of Helen coming across as the bimbo who started this whole mess, she, has something really smart to say about, narrativity and storytelling and history and all that sort of stuff. And I really appreciate those sorts of things. So I'm curious, like, do you think your identity as a female translator matters in particular ways, and in what ways?
Absolutely. I'll never claim that it doesn't matter. And this is one reason why I think we need to have, a diverse group of people looking at these texts and reading them and reimagining them. this is why both of your retellings are so important, because I mean, you're doing something that Ovid did himself, which is to take myths, refract them in a new way, give them a whole new audience for a different time with different themes that are relevant and contemporary and political. And you know, I've been teaching both of these texts, and we've talked a lot about whether your identity as writers matters in the reading of these texts. You know, we were looking at some of the descriptions that are very, very vivid and detailed in both of your works, and I've asked my students, like, do you think it matters that these are women who are rewriting these tales, and from this perspective? And if and so, you know, for myself, I know that the way I'm approaching the text is really informed by the fact that I am a woman and that I'm a feminist. And so that I'm looking at the way the body is translated. I'm looking at the way that rape is translated. So these are all really important, and I think do give me something of a new perspective. And Nina, you seem to be really aware of the perils of translation.
Sure, please go on.
Oh, no, you go.
That's, I mean, one of the things I think about a lot, I don't know, I interviewed something with Emily Wilson. She was talking about the Sirens episode, and she was saying that throughout history, there's a line, honey's song poured forth from their lips. And that, like, generation after generation, this is how it was translated by men. And how in working on it, she was like, no way, there's no mistaking here that the word is mouth, like that absolutely, like honey song poured forth from their mouth. And that she made the argument that lips is a sexier word. Mm-hmm. And so that on a word level, you have it so that, like, okay, there's something that registers as, again, these sort of sexualized creatures. Mm-hmm. Whereas, I mean, you know, you can make the argument that mouth is a sexy word too. I might think that mouth is a sexy word myself, but like the fact that, like, that on a word level, it impacts how we internalize these stories. And I really do think that, like, the stories live in us, you know, even if we're not all the way aware of it. And so I guess, yeah, like, I do think a lot about, like, it's like such, I don't know, to my mind, such a big job, because it is for you. I mean, Stephanie, like, because thinking about these, like, really word by word choices, and it matters, I think, a lot. And I think it's so amazing that you're doing it, because it's your perspective, your mind frame coming at it, I think it isn't like, oh, all these sort of male translations from the start are sort of, I mean, they're coming at it from their own, you know, point of view and mind frame. So I think, like, not a corrective. I don't think that that's how I think about it, but I mean, it is, I mean, again, just another way of looking at it.
Right. One thing that we've talked about in the class, though, is that I'm teaching right now, is, you know, at what point does translation become adaptation? Mm-hmm. And I think this is something that I would like to ask both of you about, because, I mean, you're not doing a translation, either of you, at all. And the way that you approach Ovid is really different. I mean, Paisley, you're coming more obliquely at these myths in a way. You're weaving lots of different myths together. So in the, you know, the Tiresias myth, it's Tiresias, but it's also Iphis and Dianthe. It's also Narcissus. You know, could you speak to me a little bit about why you chose to sort of weave the myths together and approach at such an oblique angle?
Yeah, well, for a couple of reasons. If I really wanted to do a one-to-one sort of adaptation, this would be obviously a monumental. Nightingale would be like 5,000 times bigger. And because once I understood what the basic argument of the book was, or the question of the book, not the argument, the question of the book, I knew I was going to have to pare it back. But I also I didn't want to simply respond to Ovid on the subject matter. One of the things that I think the Metamorphoses is so amazing about is it's also a collection of forms. I mean, you've got a mini epic, you've got love poems, you've got history writing, you've got science and philosophy, you've got, you know, these tiny short myths, and you've got these enormous long myths. And so the question for me was, okay, how can I start to play with some of the modes and the modalities that are in there? And so there are some things that I do in this book simply to, you know, like Pythagorean obviously takes up its ideas from Pythagoras stuff, but I also try to do what Ovid himself does, is one person's story turns into someone else's story, turns into another story, and stuff like that. But also, there's a private thing for me going on where within one myth, oftentimes you'll find 4 or 5. If you really know your myths, you'll see them all. But if you don't, it's okay. You don't have to. Because what I really wanted to do was isolate the question in each poem, like, what is the nature of change? Because one of the things I found fascinating about Ovid was that, his ideas of what change is and what constitutes change aren't uniform. Like some changes are terrific and they're rewards, like, Baucis and Philemon. And then other things are punishments, and things are comedic changes. Sometimes people change on the surface, but don't change interior, in their internal lives. And some people change all the way through. Some people just become more themselves. So for me, every poem was a question of like, okay, what is he arguing about change here? And trying to get a scenario that's going to elevate that more than anything else. But I was curious, Nina, because there's a fascinating way in which your stories are simultaneously very, very close to Ovid and then not at all close to Ovid. Like the language, the language, the settings are really contemporary, but you kept the names, and you did basically sort of, the divine, the supernatural show up. And I'm curious, like, what made you stick with, how did you come up with that blend? Why didn't you just say go one hardcore one way versus the other?
Yeah. I mean, so I guess when I was working on it, I was really, I would read, sort of read whatever chunk I was working on sort of a few times really closely, and then would just kind of listen in my mind. Sort of, I guess on the surface, a lot of the stories are the same. Nymph is chased by God, rescued or raped, punished or saved, and transformed. And so it was this process of really looking for the details that separated each of these sort of nymphs or figures or females out, and letting that kind of light up whatever associations it would light up for me in my brain. And when I would sort of listen, some of them spoke the way that you and I would all speak right now, and some of them were sort of more in this ancient register, and it didn't feel like this sort of like, okay, Arachne is going to be modern, like it wasn't this kind of very deliberate decision-making process. It was this sort of, I guess, I don't know what, like intuitive listening, I guess. And some of these figures sort of announced themselves as modern, and some less so.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm curious with each of you. I mean, my class has tended to focus on, questions of feminist reappropriation in some ways of Ovid. And when we had talked about what to call this, I asked you, do we want to put the label feminism on here, a feminist adaptation? And, I know I've been talking a lot with my students about the various modes of feminism that we're seeing at work in your books, but could you speak to what it was in particular? What is there something particularly feminist about your retellings? What kind of feminism are we? And I'm also curious. I mean, Paisley, maybe you could start, because you did mention Trump, and coming to this in the aftermath of the grab them comment of Trump's. I mean, were you in some ways building on the momentum of Me Too, or were you don't really want to put it within that framework?
I think there's no way I can totally separate it from that framework, even as there are ways in the book that I try to complicate that is, I try to complicate in the sense that I want to claim some of the ways as a writer, going back to this question of when we write about these violent events, are we participating in them in some way? Are we refracting them? I write about obviously a violation that happened to me, and one could just sort of say that Mira Rukeyser quote, if one woman told the truth about her life, the world would split open. So the idea of telling any sort of personal writing is a feminist act. Blah, blah, blah. I agree with that. At the same time, I also write a very long poem about a man I had lived with who had been raped as a child. And because that was a really interesting moment for me to sort of think about when we talk about rape there's an interesting way in which the language of rape has been overtaken by so many of the ways that we think of the victim as female, and we think of the psychology from a very female-centric view, and actually that does a lot of damage to male victims of rape.
Yes.
And when I'm writing about that, I'm obviously writing about something that he now has no control over because he's also dead. So it's not my experience, and he has no way to sort of write back. He is not in control of any of these things. And is that a feminist act? No, it possibly ceases not to be a feminist act. It becomes something else entirely. And there's a question that came up that I find really interesting in the Q&A, which is, would we consider Ovid feminist? By our standards, no. However, he also wrote the Heroides, like an entire collection of long letters written from the perspective of women. It's not going to satisfy our ideas of what women sound like or should, but at the same time, like, I can't think of many other male writers that were doing anything like that, trying to cast themselves in the consciousness of the other in that kind of way. And of course, once you do that, you're inevitably going to make some sort of ghastly historical mistakes that are inevitable. But at the same time, that kind of work becomes a fascinating exploration of the boundaries of self and the questions of like, what are the social limitations of what frames us as male or female, in control or not in control. And, when I think about why I am a feminist writer in this, it's not because I am the easy victim, not that feminism requires that you become a victim at all, but it is not because I'm in a singular easy position. That I think of my feminism as one that sort of has to acknowledge where it is in control, where it has power, what are the limitations of that power, and who is potentially subject to that power, as much as how am I subject to powers that I am not in control of.
That's great. And Lena, you seemed really to be building like an intersectional framework, I would say, into this book. I mean, that's something that we've talked about a lot. You wanted to voice women who have power, right? That's something that I see in the Juno character. You let Salmacis speak, who herself is a rapist. Ways that women are, as you say, Paisley, are victims, but also abusers of power themselves. I mean, were you really being very conscious about wanting to complicate women's identities? I
think that it was sort of, gosh, it's hard to know how to say it. I mean, there's just so many layers of complexity to it, and that not sort of giving this, I didn't want it to have this sort of one note of like, here we are, these powerful women telling our stories. Like, no, there's tremendous, there's rage and jealousy and violence that the women are enacting. And I sort of wanted to be honest and truthful about that as much as I could. And I think, it was the same, basically sort of similar. Like it was definitely not like, I definitely didn't sit down and sort of think like, I'm going to write this feminist text, this really interesting version of the Metamorphoses. And like, likewise, I mean, it would be impossible to say that like, I have not been absorbing that. But I think that the way I think about it is that like, it sort of goes beyond this moment and this sort of hashtag that these stories have been told for the last 2000 years and longer. And so that it sort of goes beyond, I think, this sort of current movement and the idea of giving voice in a range of ways feels, I don't know if feminist is the right word. Like a powerful, I don't know what act. I'm not sure.
Well, female-centered. I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah.
I think the ultimate thing that would make either of these texts considered feminist is that obviously, the writer of the text is female.
Right.
And that's the major change, which is that, a writer writing about, a female writer writing about these kinds of violations and these kinds of violence is potentially going to take on a different lens. I would imagine she would, even as she's been shaped by the same sort of social forces that shape men. But she's going to notice a detail that's different. She's going to want to focus in on a particular emotional reaction that's different. And that might just be, the feminist, I have to say, I would not want to have, I think it's obvious what our political sympathies probably are from reading these books. But at the same time, I think I'll flatter both of us by saying, that no one's going to read these books and say, this is a didactic argument in favor of these things, right? Like it'll lead you potentially to some of the same conclusions, but maybe some different ones too, because, you know, as Stephanie pointed out, I mean, there are some horrible women that show up in Wake Siren, right? And, you know, and if one question that I'm asking is, you know, if women are rendered voiceless by, you know, sexual assault and rape and these, you know, questions, men might be rendered equally voiceless in a completely different way, right? How do they link together?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Both of you have, I mean, Paisley, you wrote in Nightingale Gloss about your personal experience with sexual violence. Nina, you have also written about Ovid in a very personal way too, with Hammerhead. I mean, that Ovid is very woven through there. You talk about your transformation into a carpenter in very Ovidian terms. Why does Ovid allow us? I mean, I also think of Ovid somehow as like a personal entanglement of my own. But why does Ovid speak to us across 2,000 years, across gender, across time, across place? What is it about Ovid that does that? I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, you know, it's funny, like even in the sort of the two modes, like my relationship to it when I was writing Hammerhead is totally different from when it was when I was doing Wake Siren. And so it's like, it's amazing to me that even in that way, like I think in thinking about it with like, gosh, I guess the thread is like the idea of transformation, you know, this sort of the experience of being alive is to be transformed by time. Right. And I think that it's like in some ways the most human thing. I think the way for me, it's like, I guess it comes down to sort of wanting to write myself into a more comfort with the fact that all of this ends, you know? And I think that's what I'm trying to do. And I think that Ovid has helped me in that, has sort of this examination of all these kinds of transformations has, I think, helped me sort of get closer to a greater feeling of, I don't know, approaching sort of a calmer understanding of that sort of ultimate and maybe biggest transformation.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I think that's really true what Nina said about all of us undergo transformations, right? So that's what it always feels relevant. We're all undergoing transformations all of the time, whether it's outside of us or inside of us, you know, on a cellular level. So there's something that it just speaks to a very deeply human part for sure. But it also, I think, one of the things that I like about Ovid is sort of what I like about Catullus, weirdly, is that there's something about both of them that there's a sort of dirtiness to both. I mean, Catullus quite literally quite dirty, but Ovid, there's a sort of like a willingness to get into some really dark territory psychologically. And, you know, when I think about going back to how Procne and Philomela respond at first rightly with rage to what has been done with Philomela, but then it just gets disgusting and perverse, right? And the ways in which people are, you know, transformed by rage in all of these different ways. It's terrifying. But it's also so psychologically, there's something about that really spoke to me in that myth, which is that, like, when in our pursuit for justice and revenge, how far are we willing to go? Like, will we destroy the things that we love to get what we think we deserve? And I think that question that he asks is so relevant and so dark, and he's willing to sort of show the worst kind of results of that. I mean, I had to read, you know, the Aeneid in high school, and that was like a day-to-day, I wish I died experience. You know, it just felt so sanctimonious, like, you know, like it's all stuff great. There was no moment where you're like, this is, you know, really, really dark and scary. Even when he goes to hell, and I'm like, oh, let him stay there. I don't care. But yeah, but why don't they give, you know, I know why they don't give the Metamorphoses to high school Latin students, but I think you'd have a lot more classicists if you did.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. But one thing I've been thinking about with Ovid quite a bit lately is, you know, it is that experience of being human. and changing and transforming. What I have grown to love about Ovid is he lets women stand for that kind of humanity. And that to me is something, if Ovid is feminist, it's because he recognizes that that women's experience is the human experience. And I think that kind of comes through a lot in his, in his stories. I mean, what does it mean to be a human in this world? It means to be subject to change and transformation. It means for your body to be fragile. And it's women who very often are undergoing that process. And so they really do stand in for the human condition in some ways. And I think that, so often we don't let women do that in our stories. And so to me, feminism is about representing the full complexity of a woman's human life. And I think Ovid really kind of does that beautifully.
Yeah.
Yeah. Should we turn to some of the questions that our audience has put forth? I'm sorry.
Last 3 minutes.
The last 3 minutes. There are a lot. Wow. Okay. I'm going to just ask a couple at random. My student is asking, were there any characters or myths that you wanted to write about but decided not to? Paisley, I will hand that to you first. Or Nina, whichever.
Oh gosh. No, I mean, I think I even wrote poems. I wrote poems that I wanted to write, but there were ones I decided not to include. That's a different thing. So yeah, I wish I had written a Baucis and Philemon poem, and I had that in a previous book, and I wish I could have included it in Nightingale because it's a much happier story of transformation. But that's kind of it. Yeah. What about you, Nina?
Yeah, for me, there was, I'd finished the draft, and this was sort of during the revision work. And I was sort of reading over the Metamorphoses again to see what did I miss. And there was this one, and I can't remember who it was. Maybe you guys will know. It was a story of a brother and a sister.
Biblis.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And I wrote it, and I was like, and I sent it off to my editor. She was just like, take it easy. Like, you're done with the book.
Wow.
So I was just in this mode where I was like, oh, I've got to do more. So there's a few I think that I wish I don't know, that it was such this kind of bodily experience of really trying to, if I didn't hear them speaking, or if it was too similar a story, I would kind of move on. And going back, I think, yeah, there's a couple that I would still like to do.
Okay, let me ask you. There's another person whose name I recognize. I was wondering if you remembered the first translation of the Met that you read. I know that Humphrey's 1955 translation is often taught at universities, and I wonder what you think about the extensive translation legacy influencing interpretation of the sexually violent episodes in the text.
So I'll answer that quickly. I have only read the Alan Mandelbaum translation, and I stuck to that pretty religiously. And I think one of the things that appealed to me, and again, not having anything to compare it by, was how sensual it was, and sort of how vital and alive. And there were moments where I didn't feel like it was too euphemistic about the violence. He does use the word rape occasionally. And so I was taken with that one.
I just saw someone write "Boo Humphreys," and I feel bad because that was the one I really liked. I read 3, and I read them sort of simultaneously, very, very close in succession. And but Humphreys is the one I read in college, and I read the Mandelbaum when it went on sale. And then I got the Charles Martin, and I liked each one for different things. I mean, I think Humphreys I liked for nostalgic purposes. I like Mandelbaum for some of the poetic purposes. I like Martin largely when it worked as, very clean, very it's a very clean translation. I guess that's just the word it keeps coming to my mind. It really, it was just incredibly readable, but I didn't like the fact that there was a rap battle, burst out between some characters. That was maybe a little too contemporary and stuff. But I think, what was the second part of that question? It was I think about the extensive translation, the influencing interpretations of sexually violent episodes in the text. To be honest, like I didn't see that much difference in terms of euphemism. I think maybe Martin was the most direct. But I've also, you know, as a poet, I read so many other poets' refractions of Ovid too. And so it's sort of like, to me, one of the best retellings of the ways of thinking about sexual violence, or, you know, just this sort of dark underbelly of sex in general in the text, is in The Third Hour of the Night by Frank Bedart, which takes the mirror myth on. And it's just,
whoa,
it's a fantastic, and it's in the Western Night. It's from his book. I can send you the link. But that one was just a fantastic way of doing it, and much better than Ted Hughes's adaptation. Like those did not age well at all, which I think was really frustrating for me. But yeah.
The first translation I ever read was the only other woman who's done a full translation of the text, which is Mary Innes. In 1955, she did a prose translation for Penguin Classics. And I don't know how much it's read nowadays. And I find it, you know, I liked it. It's a prose translation, right? So I really like the poetic translations, but it shocks me in a way that a woman hasn't translated the text in over 65 years. And there are women who translate Ovid. Julia Haydock has done a translation of the Ars Amatoria. There have been others. There was just a French translation of the Met that came out. But yeah, it's interesting that there hasn't been one in a long time by a woman. So. Well, I wonder, would we do one more question, or would we need to wrap up? Would you be willing to do one more question?
One more question?
One more question. Okay. Let me see if I can. Oh, there's a lot. I'm trying to find. Oh, okay. Here's one that's interesting. Wendy, I don't want to use names in case people don't want me to, but thank you for your incredible translations in this important conversation. I'm here with students from the Oberlin Shakespeare and Ovid class. Teaching these myths, I have also foregrounded the treatment of rape. It feels to me to be corollary to the work of anti-racism, creating a space for discussing trauma rather than suppressing it and privileging fragility. Would you talk about how you think about the work of translating and teaching these myths with reference to social justice movements like Me Too? We've already talked a bit about that, but I'm interested, you know, what are the corollaries you see between, you know, bringing out sexual trauma in these works and the work of anti-racism? I'm thinking of Arachne's story. I mean, you seem to be taking on to be building that into the conversation around Black Lives Matter, for example.
Yeah, I mean, so there was certainly, I mean, I guess it is thinking about, I guess to be sort of more specific about Me Too, in the way that we sort of have seen the way that these figures are getting, you know, accused of certain acts, and then more and more and more women stand up. And so the idea of the power of saying, and the power of telling the story. And I guess what I would say is that we women, people are taught not to speak up, to sort of, I think, sort of question, like, oh, maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe I'm imagining it. You know, is this going to sound hysterical? Am I overreacting? And this idea, in fact, like that's can be insane making, you know, quite literally. And I think that the more people speak up and say, like, in fact, no, this happened to me and it was not right, and I know it, and other people sort of rising up because of that. This is a inept answer to that, but I think it has to do with more people using their voice and saying, this is not right.
I think one of the temptations with a lot of books, and why a lot of books tend to fail in this conversation, is when we want to try to have almost a one-to-one correlation, or to have something that maybe the writer from the past was meant to anticipate, but of course could not, and can't then actually address the changed values of the contemporary classroom and the contemporary political moments. So one of the things that I think becomes important is how we frame the question of the lens into the text. So, you know, what I would do is, instead of say, let's look at rape, you know, in these particular stories, I would actually ask a very different question. I would sort of ask, what is the portrait of power that Ovid is drawing? Like, who is in power and how do people in power behave? Let's look at these 5 myths. And how would we characterize these people? And then sort of say, like, how do the people who we might imagine speaking back or speaking towards power, how did they behave? And what kind of routes do they take? And I think that becomes a way of starting to ask these larger questions about how is it that there is something about Ovid that might reframe or speak to this present moment, even in its indirection or in its lack of satisfaction in our own value system today. I think we can certainly have a conversation about the limitations of art and speech and what political engagement looks like, and the power of metaphor, right? Like the way, going back to something Stephanie said earlier about that, how did he get away with saying what he said? Well, part of it is that it's the way that you read the metaphors. It's the way that you read the images, right? Like they tell multiple stories at one time. And that's really the true power of poetry, is sort of like, what the real story is. That's the thing that's unsaid in a weird way. Right. The rest of it is like the scaffolding to what's being there. And if we think about the Metamorphoses as a long conversation about power and powerlessness and the changing and fluctuating relationships and the dynamic relationship between the two, I think that allows people to approach these really tough conversations, things that people feel like, I don't want to go there because now you're making me talk about a subject that just makes me feel awful.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think, approaching the text through the lens of power is absolutely how it continues to be relevant. And bringing speech into that. Who do you allow to speak? Who do you make speak? This is another question too. There's been something that, and I really felt this in my class discussions with both of these, I think with the Hecuba story in Wake Siren, and then with the Nightingale a Gloss as well, is that both of you really nicely bring up the problems with making people tell trauma as well, right? And it's not healing always. Sometimes it's really traumatic. We rely often upon other people to translate that for us. Sometimes they do it wrong, but I think we need to be aware too, and Ovid helps us to do this, of listening and not making people, letting people tell their stories, and not compelling them to do so when they don't want to. And this is something that I think both of you do very nicely. And so what you're saying, Nia, is think about who's speaking and how you are giving voice to people as well, in an empowering way, and very wrapped up with these themes. But, well, we would be here all day if we answered all of the questions. Thank you. I could do that, but I won't. Thank you both so much for talking to me. I've been looking so forward to this, and your books I've carried them around the world with me, literally. I was living in Australia last year. I had them with me. I read them there, and I'll carry them with me for a long, long time. So I really, really very much appreciate you talking to me.
So much. A total pleasure. This really, really, Stephanie, like truly, truly excellent to be part of this.
Yeah, I was so happy. This was like the best thing I got to do all year. So.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and we will say adieu. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.